What happens when artistic genius collides with financial reality? How did Hollywood's most celebrated masterpieces become the very films that destroyed the studios that made them? Fritz Lang spent a fortune building practical sets for an entire futuristic city. Orson Welles blew through $800,000 to make the greatest film ever that nobody wanted to see. And Joseph von Sternberg created the most visually stunning film of the 30s, only to be fired before completion. These critically acclaimed masterpieces didn't just fail at the box office, they obliterated entire studios. Metropolis, 1927, UFA Studios. Fritz Lang's science fiction epic Metropolis wasn't just ambitious, it was borderline insane. At a time when most films cost around $50,000 to produce, Lang convinced UFA Studios to pour a staggering $5.1 million into his futuristic vision. The director was obsessed with authenticity, building enormous practical sets, including an entire futuristic cityscape, underground worker compounds, and functioning machines. One scene featuring artificial rain required 48 tons of water and nearly drowned several extras. UFA executives watched in horror as the budget ballooned to becoming the most expensive film ever made at that point in history. Lang's perfectionism was legendary. He demanded 90 takes of a single shot, where actress Brigitte Helm simply had to look up from a table. When the studio begged him to scale back, he reportedly responded, "If it costs $3 million, that's what it costs." The film took 17 months to shoot and employed over 37,000 extras. When Metropolis finally premiered, critics praised its groundbreaking visuals, but audiences stayed away, repelled by its complex storyline and intimidating length. The film recouped just a quarter of its enormous budget. The financial disaster was so catastrophic that UFA Studios, once Germany's most powerful film company, was forced to merge with its biggest competitor, Paramount MGM, to avoid complete bankruptcy. Lang never again enjoyed the same creative freedom, and German cinema lost its position as Hollywood's main rival. Film critic Roger Ebert later wrote, "Metropolis was not just a film, but a technological declaration of war that bankrupted the studio that birthed it. Today it's considered one of the most important and influential films ever made, with its DNA visible in everything from Blade Runner to The Matrix." Intolerance, 1916. Triangle Film Corporation, Josh Wark Producing Corporation. D.W. Griffith's Intolerance was the filmmaker's direct response to accusations of racism following The Birth of a Nation. Determined to create the most ambitious film in history, Griffith envisioned a sprawling epic that would weave together 4 stories across 2,500 years of human history. The production was unprecedented in scale. For the Babylonian sequence alone, Griffith constructed 300-foot-tall sets occupying over 3 city blocks in Hollywood. The famous Fall of Babylon sequence required 16,000 extras, 250 chariots, and a fleet of elephants. When studio executives at Triangle Film Corporation saw the mounting costs, eventually hitting $2.5 million, they panicked. But Griffith had complete creative control. The film's revolutionary intercutting between 4 different time periods confused and alienated 1916 audiences. Despite critical acclaim for its technical achievements, Intolerance was a commercial disaster, recouping less than a third of its massive budget. The financial toll was devastating. Triangle Film Corporation never recovered from the loss, selling off its assets within 3 years. Griffith personally lost $1 million of his own money and was forced to establish Wark Producing Corporation to finish the film, which also went bankrupt shortly after. Film historian Kevin Brownlow noted, "Griffith built the grandest cinematic vision ever conceived, and in doing so, destroyed his own career." Today, Intolerance is studied in every film school as a masterpiece of early cinema, with its innovative editing techniques and ambitious scope influencing generations of filmmakers from Sergei Eisenstein to Francis Ford Coppola. The Magnificent Ambersons, 1942, Mercury Productions at RKO Pictures. Following Citizen Kane, Orson Welles had the film world at his feet. For his second feature, he chose Booth Tarkington's novel about a wealthy family's decline in the early automobile age. RKO Pictures, excited by the critical acclaim of Kane, gave Welles extraordinary creative freedom, Despite that film's modest commercial performance, Wells spared no expense, building elaborate period sets and using innovative deep-focus photography techniques that required special lighting setups costing thousands of extra dollars. His original cut ran 131 minutes and, according to those who saw it, was even better than Citizen Kane. But when Wells left to shoot documentary footage in Brazil for the U.S. government disaster struck, initial preview screenings in Pomona went poorly, with audiences finding the film depressing. Instead of waiting for Wells to return, RKO panicked. They cut 43 minutes from the film, shot a new, happier ending, and effectively destroyed Wells's vision. Even in its butchered form, the movie cost $1.1 million but earned just $630,000 at the box office. The financial disaster was so severe that RKO fired Wells and wrote off Mercury Productions entirely. The studio never fully recovered from the loss, weakening financially before being sold off to Howard Hughes in 1948. As for Wells, he became Hollywood's most notorious artistic martyr, a genius director who never again received full studio backing. Film critic Pauline Kael later wrote that the original version would have been the greatest American film ever made. The irony is brutal. What remains of The Magnificent Ambersons is still considered a masterpiece, with the Library of Congress selecting it for preservation in the National Film Registry as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The Devil is a Woman, 1935, Paramount Pictures. Joseph von Sternberg and Marlene Dietrich's final collaboration should have been their crowning achievement. Set in 19th century Spain, this visually opulent film showcased Dietrich at her most alluring as a femme fatale who destroys men with casual indifference. Paramount executives initially supported the project, but watched in horror as von Sternberg's perfectionism drove the budget to unprecedented levels. He insisted on recreating Spanish carnivals with hundreds of extras in elaborate costumes. For a simple rain sequence, he demanded that the water be illuminated from precisely the right angle, necessitating an entirely new lighting system that cost $75,000 in today's money. The cinematography was revolutionary. Von Sternberg used intricate layering of light, shadow, and gauze filters to create images that looked more like Baroque paintings than conventional film shots. But these techniques required custom equipment and endless takes, causing production costs to skyrocket to nearly $900,000. When the film was finally released, audiences rejected it completely. The bleak story and artistic visuals were too advanced for 1935 moviegoers, and the film earned just $200,000. The financial hit came at the worst possible time for Paramount, which was already teetering on the edge of insolvency due to the Great Depression. Within months, the studio declared bankruptcy and underwent complete reorganization. Von Sternberg was effectively blacklisted, never again working with the budget or creative freedom he'd enjoyed previously. The Spanish government was so offended by the film's portrayal of Spanish men that they banned all Paramount films from Spain and threatened to burn the negative. Film historian Andrew Sarris later called it the most beautiful black and white film ever made, and directors from Martin Scorsese to Pedro Almodovar have cited it as a major influence. Like so many artistic masterpieces, its brilliance was only recognized decades after it helped destroy the very studio that created it. The Red Shoes, 1948. The Archers, just independent producers. Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's breathtaking Technicolor ballet drama, The Red Shoes, nearly ruined their production company, before becoming one of the most influential films in cinema history. J. Arthur Rank, the British distribution magnate who financed the film, initially supported Powell and Pressburger's ambitious vision, but as production costs soared to £505,000, approximately $9 million in today's money, he began to panic. The filmmakers insisted on shooting the central 15-minute ballet sequence as a pure artistic expression rather than a narrative necessity, a concept almost unheard of in 1958, 1948. The technicians had to develop entirely new methods to capture the elaborate dance sequences, including a special floating camera platform that moved with the dancers. The Technicolor process required 3 times more lighting than standard films, and Powell demanded dozens of takes for each shot, insisting that the color values had to be precisely right. When The Red Shoes finally premiered, British audiences were indifferent, and American distributors initially refused to release it, claiming that Americans wouldn't watch a film about ballet. The film managed only a modest initial release, with box office returns far below its enormous cost. The financial disaster forced Powell and Pressburger production company, The Archers, to merge with the larger independent producers studio, essentially ending their independence. Rank, furious about his losses, severely restricted their budgets on future projects. The great irony came years later when the film found its audience through art house revivals. Martin Scorsese has called it the film that most inspired him to become a director. And in 2009, he personally financed a complete restoration. Today, The Red Shoes is considered one of the greatest British films ever made and among the most beautiful uses of Technicolor in cinema history, with the British Film Institute ranking it the 9th greatest British film of all time. Greed, 1924. Metro-Goldwyn Pictures. Erich von Stroheim's adaptation of Frank Norris's novel McTeague began as an attempt to create the most realistic film ever made. Von Stroheim insisted on shooting on actual locations described in the novel, including Death Valley in the middle of summer, where temperatures reached 120 degrees and several crew members collapsed from heat exhaustion. The director's commitment to realism knew no bounds. He demanded that the character's shabby apartment be built with real lath and plaster rather than studio facades. When a scene called for a dental office, he had real dental equipment from the 1890s sourced and installed. His attention to detail extended to insisting that extras in street scenes have pockets filled with actual period-appropriate contents, even though these would never be seen on camera. After 2 years of production, von Stroheim delivered his cut, a 42-reel, 8-hour epic that he considered his masterpiece. Studio executives at Metro-Goldwyn were horrified. The newly merged studio was already facing financial difficulties, and they demanded cuts. Von Stroheim eventually delivered a 4-hour version, which was still deemed too long. Without his permission, the studio slashed the film to 140 minutes, destroying much of his vision. Even in its mutilated form, Greed cost $750,000, $11.5 million today, and earned less than $250,000 at the box office. The financial hit contributed significantly to Metro-Goldwyn's near bankruptcy and forced merger with Louis B. Mayer's smaller studio to create MGM. Von Stroheim's career never recovered. He was labeled impossible to work with and eventually reduced to acting rather than directing. The original full-length version of Greed is considered cinema's greatest lost masterpiece. Film critic Pauline Kael called the lost original cut the most discussed film that almost no one has seen. Despite this, the surviving version of Greed is still regarded as one of silent cinema's greatest achievements, with its unflinching portrayal of human avarice and moral decay influencing generations of filmmakers from Orson Welles to Paul Thomas Anderson. The Night of the Hunter, 1955. Paul Gregory Productions. Actor Charles Laughton's only directorial effort, The Night of the Hunter, wasn't just a commercial failure. It was so poorly received that it ended his directing career after just one film. Today, it's considered one of the greatest American films ever made. United Artists agreed to distribute the film, but provided only a modest budget of $700,000. Laughton, determined to create something truly original, hired cinematographer Stanley Cortez, who had shot The Magnificent Ambersons. Together, they created a visual style that blended German Expressionism, Southern Gothic, and nightmare fairy tale imagery, unlike anything American audiences had seen before. Laughton insisted on elaborate stylized sets rather than realistic locations, creating a dreamlike river journey sequence that took weeks to film in a studio tank. He coached child actors through dozens of takes, spending days on scenes that would normally be shot in hours. When producers complained about the mounting costs, Laughton reportedly responded, "I'm not making a movie, I'm making a nightmare." When The Night of the Hunter was released in 1955, both audiences and critics rejected it completely. Its disturbing imagery, ambiguous morality, and unique visual style simply didn't connect with 1950s moviegoers. The film earned just $400,000 against its $700,000 budget. The financial failure doomed Paul Gregory Productions, which folded shortly after the film's release. Lawton, devastated by the rejection, never directed again, returning to acting until his death in 1962. The film's redemption came decades later when a new generation of critics and filmmakers rediscovered it. Director Martin Scorsese said, "It's one of the most terrifying movies ever made." In 1992, it was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry, and today it frequently appears on lists of the greatest films of all time. Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, 1927, Fox Film Corporation. When Fox Film Corporation brought German expressionist director F.W. Murnau to Hollywood, they gave him an unprecedented $1 million budget, equivalent to $15 million today, and complete creative control to create what they hoped would be the most artistically significant film ever made. Murnau spent lavishly, constructing enormous sets including an entire working city, covering over 20 acres, and a fully functional trolley system. For a simple marsh scene, he had engineers develop a new fog-making system rather than rely on standard smoke effects. His insistence on complex camera movements required the development of new technology, including a custom dolly that could move in any direction. While production costs soared to $1.2 million, Fox executives remained confident that Murnau's artistic reputation would translate to box office success. They were wrong. Despite winning the only Academy Award ever given for unique and artistic production at the first Oscar ceremony, Sunrise earned just $550,000 at the box office. The financial blow came at the worst possible time. Just as Fox was reeling from this loss, the transition to sound films required massive investment in new technology. The combined financial pressure forced Fox Film Corporation into a precarious position, eventually leading to its merger with 20th Century Pictures in 1935. Murnau never completed another Hollywood film, returning to Europe where he died in a car accident in 1931. The great tragedy is that Sunrise is now universally recognized as one of cinema's greatest achievements. Legendary critic Roger Ebert called it a landmark of artistic achievement, and in 2012, the Sight and Sound Critics poll named it the 5th greatest film of all time. The Most Beautiful, 1944, Toho Film. During World War II, Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa embarked on his second feature film, a propaganda piece that would ironically become one of his most personal artistic statements. The Most Beautiful focused on female workers in an optics factory making lenses for military equipment, and Toho Film expected a straightforward patriotic drama. Kurosawa, however, had other ideas. Obsessed with authenticity, he insisted the actresses live in a real factory dormitory for weeks before filming began. He had them learn actual lens polishing techniques from factory workers, resulting in actresses with bandaged, bleeding fingers. When studio executives complained about the extended pre-production period and mounting costs, Kurosawa reportedly responded, "We aren't making a movie about factory workers. We're creating factory workers who act." The production quickly went over budget as Kurosawa shot over 50,000 feet of film, 10 times what was typical for a Japanese film of that era. His insistence on filming in an actual working factory during wartime led to numerous delays and complications, as military officials constantly interrupted shoots for security concerns. When completed, the film cost Toho nearly 500,000 yen, approximately $5 million in today's currency, an astronomical sum for a Japanese studio during wartime. While the film received some positive critical attention, severe wartime restrictions on the theater operations and Japan's increasingly dire situation meant The Most Beautiful barely recouped a quarter of its budget. The financial strain nearly bankrupted Toho, which survived only through a government bailout, linking the studio even more tightly to wartime propaganda efforts. Kurosawa himself was almost blacklisted, but was saved by his mentor, director Kajiro Yamamoto. Today, The Most Beautiful is recognized as a formative work in Kurosawa's development, showcasing his obsession with realism and the documentary-like approach that would later define masterpieces like Seven Samurai. Film historian Donald Ritchie called it the moment when Kurosawa found his voice as a filmmaker, despite it nearly ending his career before it truly began. Lola Montes, 1955, Gamma Film. Max Ophüls' final film, Lola Montes, was the most expensive European production of its time and the director's only color film. Based on the life of the notorious 19th century dancer and courtesan, Ophüls envisioned a non-linear narrative structured as a circus performance, with Lola's scandals presented as circus acts. Gamma Film, a small French-German production company, agreed to finance what they thought would be a commercial historical drama, but Ophüls had grander ambitions. He demanded elaborate circus sets with functioning trapeze equipment, massive painted backdrops, and a rotating camera track that encircled the entire main circus ring. For flashback sequences, he insisted on recreating period-perfect salon interiors and royal palaces. The budget quickly ballooned to over 700 million francs, approximately $8 million today. Ophüls' perfectionism reached legendary status. For a simple scene of Lola dancing on a tightrope, he had actress Martine Carroll train with professional circus performers for weeks, then insisted on 38 takes despite her exhaustion and fear of heights. When Lola Montes premiered at the 1955 Venice Film Festival, critics were baffled by its fragmented narrative and formal experimentation. Commercial audiences rejected it completely. Gamma Film, facing imminent bankruptcy, forced Ophüls to re-edit the film into chronological order and cut nearly 25 minutes, destroying his artistic vision. Even this compromised version failed commercially, earning less than a quarter of its massive budget. Gamma Film collapsed within months, and Ophüls died 2 years later, devastated by what he considered the mutilation of his masterpiece. The irony came decades later when Lola Montes was restored to Ophüls' original vision. Director Stanley Kubrick declared it the greatest film ever made, and François Truffaut wrote that, "Everything that I want from cinema is in this film." Modern critics consider it one of cinema's greatest achievements in color, cinematography, and camera movement. Its commercial failure now a mere footnote to its artistic triumph. Napoleon, 1927. Société Générale des Films. Abel Gance's silent epic about Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't just ambitious. It was revolutionary in ways that nearly destroyed its production company. Société Générale des Films gave Gance a budget of 17 million francs, approximately $18 million today, to create what they hoped would be France's definitive historical epic. Gance had plans that went far beyond conventional filmmaking. He invented new camera techniques, including mounting cameras on horses, sleds, and pendulums. For battle scenes, cameramen wore the camera on their chest and ran alongside actors. Most famously, he developed the revolutionary polyvision technique, a precursor to widescreen, using 3 synchronized projectors to create a massive triptych image. The production became legendary for its excesses. For the Corsica sequences, Gance insisted on filming in Bonaparte's actual childhood home. For snowy retreat scenes, he took the entire production to the Alps in winter, resulting in cameras freezing and several crew members suffering frostbite. The original shooting schedule of 6 months stretched to nearly 3 years. When finally completed in 1927, Napoleon ran over 7 hours and required special projection equipment for its triptych sequences. The premiere was a cultural sensation, but a financial disaster. The specialized projection requirements meant few theaters could actually show the film as Gance intended, and the full version played in only a handful of French theaters. The film's enormous cost and minimal returns bankrupted Société Générale des Films, which folded within 2 years. Gance spent the rest of his career trying to preserve and restore his masterpiece, which existed in various truncated versions for decades. Film historian Kevin Brownlow spent over 50 years reconstructing Gance's original vision. And in 2016, the fully restored 7-hour version with polyvision sequences was finally screened. Martin Scorsese called it a genuine cinematographic revolution, and Francis Ford Coppola sponsored restoration screenings with a live orchestra. What destroyed a studio in 1927 is now recognized as one of cinema's most revolutionary achievements. Limite, 1931, Cinédia. Brazilian director Mario Peixoto was just 22 years old when he created what would become Latin America's most legendary art film, and nearly destroyed Brazil's first major film studio in the process. After seeing a photograph in a French magazine of two handcuffed hands reaching out from water, Peixoto developed an experimental narrative about three shipwrecked individuals reflecting on their past lives. Cinedia, Brazil's pioneering studio, agreed to finance what they thought would be a commercial melodrama, but Peixoto had more experimental ideas. He insisted on filming real drowning scenes, with safety divers just out of frame, spent weeks capturing waves from different angles, and demanded complex camera movements that required custom-built equipment. The production stretched from a planned 3 weeks to over 8 months as Peixoto meticulously crafted sequences that had little to do with conventional narrative. The budget ballooned to over 1 million reais, approximately $3 million today, an astronomical sum for a Brazilian production of the era. When Limite was finally screened in 1931, audiences were completely baffled by its non-narrative structure and abstract imagery. It played in just 2 theaters in Rio de Janeiro before being pulled due to poor attendance. Cinedia never recovered from the financial blow, especially as the global depression hit Brazil's economy, and the studio was forced to drastically downsize, eventually becoming a mere rental facility for other productions. Peixoto never directed another film. His career effectively ended by Limite's commercial failure. The film itself nearly disappeared, with only a single print surviving, stored in Peixoto's bathroom for decades. The great irony came decades later when filmmaker Walter Salles helped restore the film, and critics finally recognized its genius. Sergei Eisenstein called it one of cinema's greatest achievements, and Orson Welles traveled to Brazil specifically to see the only existing print. Today, Limite is considered the greatest Brazilian film ever made and a pioneering work of visual poetry. Its commercial failure, a distant memory compared to its artistic significance. The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, Société Générale des Films. Carl Theodor Dreyer's silent masterpiece about the trial and execution of Joan of Arc wasn't just artistically revolutionary, it was financially catastrophic for its already struggling production company. Société Générale des Films, still reeling from the massive expenditure on Abel Gance's Napoleon the previous year, gave Dreyer a substantial budget of 7 million francs, approximately $7 million today, and expected a commercial historical drama. Instead, Dreyer created one of cinema's most austere and challenging works. The Danish director's approach was radical. He insisted on building massive concrete sets of the trial chambers, only to barely use them, instead focusing almost entirely on close-ups of actors' faces. He demanded that all actors perform without makeup, unheard of at the time, and had actress Renée Falconetti cut off her hair for real on camera. When cinematographer Rudolf Maté suggested conventional coverage, Dreyer reportedly fired 3 camera operators until he found one willing to shoot exactly as directed. The production schedule stretched from a planned 3 months to nearly a year, as Dreyer shot over 700,000 feet of film for what would become an 82-minute feature. His obsession with authenticity extended to the execution sequence, where he insisted on using real fire near actors, resulting in several serious injuries among the crew. When The Passion of Joan of Arc premiered, critics recognized its artistic achievement, but audiences rejected its uncompromising style and harrowing emotional intensity. The film earned less than 2 million francs, covering barely a quarter of its production cost. The financial disaster dealt the final blow to Société Générale des Films, which declared bankruptcy within months. Adding to the tragedy, a fire destroyed the original negative shortly after completion, and for decades, the film circulated only in inferior copies until a complete print was miraculously discovered in a Norwegian mental institution in 1981. Today, The Passion of Joan of Arc is consistently ranked among the greatest films ever made, with Falconetti's performance considered perhaps the most powerful in cinema history. Director Luis Buñuel said, "In one film, Dreyer surpassed all that had been accomplished in the past and drew a fixed boundary between the past and future of film art. The Fall of the House of Usher, 1928, Gene Epstein Productions." Gene Epstein's adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's Gothic tale was one of the most visually innovative films of the silent era, and the one that bankrupted the director's own production company. After struggling to secure financing through conventional studios, Epstein established his own production entity and poured his personal savings into the project. Epstein's vision for The Fall of the House of Usher went far beyond typical horror films of the period. He developed new techniques for creating dreamlike imagery, including shooting through gauze, petroleum jelly smeared on lenses, and mirrors that distorted the image. For sequences where the house appears to breathe, he built elaborate miniatures with mechanical components that took weeks to construct and film properly. The production budget quickly exceeded 500,000 francs, approximately $3 million today, an enormous sum for an independent production of the era. Epstein's perfectionism became legendary. For a simple shot of swaying trees outside the Usher mansion, he waited 3 days for the perfect wind conditions, rather than using artificial methods. When the film was finally released, critics praised its visual poetry, but commercial audiences found it too abstract and intellectual. It played briefly in Parisian art theaters before disappearing, earning back less than a tenth of its production cost. The financial disaster bankrupted Epstein's production company, and he spent years paying off personal debts. His career never fully recovered, and he struggled to find financing for future projects. Eventually being forced to make commercial. The Fall of the House of Usher was rediscovered by the French New Wave filmmakers, who recognized it as a pioneering work of cinematic impressionism. Director Jean Cocteau called it the only film that truly captures the essence of dreams, and Martin Scorsese cited it as a major influence on his own visual style. What once bankrupted its creator is now studied in every serious film program as a cornerstone of avant-garde cinema. Orpheus, 1950, Films du Palais Royal. Jean Cocteau's modernized retelling of the Orpheus myth wasn't just artistically ambitious, it nearly destroyed its small production company. Films du Palais Royal, established specifically to produce Cocteau's vision, invested their entire capital in what they hoped would be a commercially viable art film. Cocteau's approach defied commercial considerations. He insisted on practical effects rather than optical tricks, creating the famous mirror passage scene by filling gloves with mercury and filming actors passing through a pool of water shot from below. For the underworld sequences, he demanded elaborate sets built at odd angles with specially constructed furniture to create a disorienting environment. The film's budget quickly ballooned to over 80 million francs, approximately $4.5 million today, as Cocteau's perfectionism led to numerous reshoots. For a sequence lasting less than a minute, where death drives Orpheus through the zone between worlds, Cocteau had technicians construct a complex rear projection system that took weeks to perfect. When Orpheus premiered at the 1950 Venice Film Festival, critics hailed it as a masterpiece, but commercial audiences were less enthusiastic. The film's philosophical complexity and symbolic imagery confused mainstream viewers, and it earned barely half its production cost, despite positive reviews. The financial strain effectively ended Films du Palais Royal, which produced no further works and was dissolved within 2 years. Cocteau himself struggled to finance his next film, waiting 8 years before finding backing for Testament of Orpheus. The great irony is that Orpheus is now considered one of cinema's most influential works, with directors from David Lynch to Guillermo del Toro citing it as a major inspiration. Film critic Roger Ebert called it the most beautiful visualization of the supernatural ever created, and in 2016, the British Film Institute ranked it among the 50 greatest films ever made. So the next time you watch a beloved classic, remember, behind some of cinema's greatest triumphs lies the wreckage of the very studios that made them possible. Their sacrifice, however unintentional, gave us an artistic legacy that continues to inspire generations of filmmakers and film lovers alike. If you're hungry for more buried treasure, hit subscribe and keep your curiosity humming, because the past still has plenty of futures left to reveal.